George, you spent about 50 years in London with the BBC at times, with London University at other times. You had a distinguished career, and at a time when, of course, the countries in this part of the world were under communist control, you were a regular commentator on how things were going here and how they should go. Since you've been back in Hungary, since the change, you've developed a second life as a politician, elected to the member 3 times, I think, to the European Parliament, where you. This is the 3rd mandate, so possible 4th is coming up. Okay, let me then invite you to respond to what Richard has said. Thank you.
So, thank you very much for this invitation. Good afternoon, everybody. And I suppose really I'm delighted to be able to say with how much I agree with my very distinguished colleague, Professor Legutko. Now, there are overlaps, and I couldn't find a single disagreement, except that in 1 or 2 areas I would develop his argument, which may be in his book, which I haven't had yet the chance to read. And then I'll say a few more things about demons, which you sort of touched on at the very beginning, but I think I've discovered some more demons. They seem to be luring in the undergrowth. So first of all, and I think this is right, the similarities between what we can call Marxism-Leninism and what passes for liberalism today. Let me add here that when I was young, we had social democracy and Christian democracy and conservatism, but today we only seem to have liberal democracy. And this is a fascinating issue. How come? And I'll come on to this, that liberalism has somehow generated a monopoly over democracy. I have huge arguments, including incidentally with some of my Christian Democrat colleagues, when they say, no, all democracy is liberal democracy. And we really should think about this. So on the similarities between communism and liberal democracy, I would add they both suffer from a closed epistemology. Increasingly, their capacity to take on new ideas is diminishing. If you look back at communism, certainly in this country, but pretty much anywhere else in this region, prior to 1989, they were anti-innovative at the intellectual level. Under the surface, things were happening, but it was not affecting the system. And I think this gap, this decorrelation, was part of the story as to why communism collapsed. Is this going to happen to liberalism? Well, watch this space. I very much agree on the non-debatable propositions that both rely on. We do not accept counter-argument. If you attempt to argue against us, then you're a reactionary, you're a populist, you're a xenophobe, you're a nativist, you're whatever we happen to decide that day is the word by which to condemn you. Again, I was very taken the language of necessity. I mean, historical necessity is, of course, very much part of the Marxist-Leninist legacy. But don't forget, I would add this to your model, there is always an escape hatch. The great escape hatch for the communists was false consciousness. And the current escape hatch for the liberals is elite manipulation. Lenin used that as well. He talked about the crafty bourgeois who's always misleading the honest worker, the honest proletarian. But it seems to me that this is one of the answers which one gets from this liberal hegemony, that, they'll see it in the end, but at the moment we have to fight against the elite manipulation. I've yet to discover anyone, spokesperson for the liberal perspective, who's talked about false consciousness. Can't be far away. It's such a convenient way of saying these people, of course, really will understand their true interests. It's very Marxist and has become very much a part of the liberal perspective. I would add, which is sort of implicit in some of what you said, that there is linear view of history. It's teleological. It's moving in a particular direction, and you can't do anything about it. If you do, then you're a bystander. History will pass you by. History will pass you by. I mean, this fascinating concept of history having a personality. Now, you will all know that there was a certain president of the United States who kept talking about the wrong side of history. What rubbish! What nonsense! History doesn't have sides. If history has sides, does it have a top and a bottom and inside and outside? I mean, this is a metaphor. It's a spatial metaphor. Don't ever be captured by metaphors, you know, like superstructure. It's a Marxist one. If anybody's ever tempted to be captured by metaphors, the best antidote is to read Bourdieu, who was a person of the left, but I think gave us a number of intellectual tools with which to see the nonsense that is spewed out by certain parts of the political field. I mean, there are other views of how history works. The cyclical view is obviously quite a strong one, that it just moves and then repeats itself. Or what I think is particularly appropriate for this part of the world, history is a series of caesuras. There are gaps when we lose agency. I don't think I need mention Trianon to anyone in this audience, but think about the partitions of Poland, think about Munich, total helplessness. External agents transform us. And this brings me to the social engineering. Now, I actually see the social engineering as a much bigger topic than you put it relatively narrowly. There is a reading of history, and I suggest it's only one reading, but I think it's a powerful reading, that the West has repeatedly imposed patterns on Central Europe, or the Russians, as the case may be, or the Turks, large external powers, or the local empires, against which the cultural communities in the region were pretty helpless. Again, I mean, think of the way in which your own Poland was shifted westwards 250 kilometers. Did the Poles have a say over this? Not a lot. Did the 3 million Hungarians who found themselves living in other states ever demand that they be citizens of Romania or Czechoslovakia? No. Does it matter? Who cares? That was certainly the attitude after the Paris Peace settlement, or the redrawing of frontiers. There may have been one or two exceptions, but in 1945-47, I think every country's frontier changed somewhat. Even Hungary's frontier changed. And I'm not going to tell you which it is. Hungarians here should know. Where did Hungary's frontier change in 1947? Next topic I thought was quite interesting is, again, the parallel. If you have a leading role party, and I think the current liberal perspective is not identical. I mean, they don't have access to Gulag yet. But it's the depoliticization, that a growing range of ideas, activities are self-evident and are not a part of political debate, but are, if you like, outsourced to the judiciary, to civil society, to non-political or apolitical actors who are not accountable, or not very easily accountable, to the views of the voters. Indeed, when the voters express a view, they're told, be quiet, you're just being populist. Now, this is dangerous because it comes back and bites you from behind. I would add a factor in terms of the roots of the similarity. I lived through this, and I suspect in Poland it wasn't quite like that. 1968, the 68 Arts. The legacy of 1968, I think, was enormously important in generating a belief system, the utopianism, the remediality or remediability of the backwardness of society, that, you know, we will lead them and going with that, the impatience and to some extent the intransigence. That there is a research agenda there. It seems to me that when, to use your idea, society is permeated, I think a Marxist would use imbricated here, by a particular idea, then there is no need for politics. In other words, to me, these are profoundly dangerous. We're talking about social harmony. a world in which there is no conflict, no contest, because it's a graveyard. And where do we go from here? What else? There were other things. Yes, there's another aspect of this particular worldview, which is partly Western liberal, partly European liberal, partly I think it comes from the United States, is that ethnicity, one's own culture, is inherently wrong, possibly evil. But if you say that actually, you know, being Hungarian, being concerned with whoever is Hungarian, whether they live in Hungary or the other side of the border, well, that necessarily affects citizenship and is seen as inherently dangerous, wrong, revisionist. And these are absolute categories. It's right, wrong. You can't say, look, you know, well, my particular ethnicity is this, this, and this, and I can't see any problem with this. And the others say, no, no, you can't be ethnic, unless you are part of the third world migrants living in various Western states. I remember a conversation, some of you will know what the Runnymede Trust is. It's a kind of racial ethnic equality body in England. Britain, no, I don't think they operate much north of the border, but open to question on that. And I was involved in some joint project with them, and by that time, so we're talking about 98, 2000, the word ethnic in contemporary usage in English was to do with immigrants and their descendants. And I sort of looked at them and said, do you recognize me as ethnic? And I said, well, mumble, mumble. And I said, well, I'm Hungarian. They didn't like it. They didn't like it at all because for them, ethnic was restricted to a very narrow category. And I sort of said to them, but look, I'm Hungarian. I'm of Asiatic descent. My ancestors came to Europe from Asia. They were totally thrown by that. They couldn't bring themselves to say, oh no, you can't be Asian, you don't look Asian. That would be racist. So they went away mumbling, et cetera, but at the end of the day, there are dilemmas, insoluble dilemmas in this particular situation, which I think the whole liberal way of thinking cannot answer. I fully agree with you about political correctness. That's a relatively new development, maybe 20 years old, and I think it's accelerating. I think it's a dynamic process. You talked about, yes, creating a world in which the individual lives in comfort, I think without aspirations, without demands. Now, I don't know how many of you have read Kundera's The Unbearable Lightness of Being. The latter part of the book is exactly this. It's a world of unchanging, changelessness. And I read the book when it came out in English, and then I reread it in Hungarian, as I seem to recall. And I remember going to Prague in autumn 1990, I think, and realizing that Kundera was a sociologist, that this was Czechoslovakia, a total lack of change between 1968 and then the world 1990. Of course, things have changed. Changed very slowly, I may say, but it did change. And I think the lesson to take from this world of unchangingness, a finite world, is A, that it's very boring. And you get dysfunctions, you get people doing things which the authorities can't understand because we've given you this perfect world. Why are you doing this? Because we are bored out of our skulls. And at the same time, it can't be sustained. And here I refer to Bakhtin, the idea of monology, and the proposition that this cannot be sustained. It can be sustained over time, but not for long. Eventually, something breaks this. Some single proposition idea, and it's generally discursive, comes into the system and breaks it up. So, to come back to your final point, what is to be done? And I'm sure you are not putting yourself in the role of Lenin and Chernyshevsky, so I'm not going to do that either. But it seems to me that the liberal monopoly, or the liberal monology, is beginning to erode. It's beginning to lose its capacity to control the public sphere. Alternatives are emerging. They are to some extent inchoate. They are stigmatized as populist, as lots of other words. It's not a single coherent opposition, and in that sense, it's sort of ironic that what unites them is the role allotted to them by their opponents. One word here about, and I have to talk about this, illiberalism. Now, Prime Minister of Hungary, in a speech in Tusnád, used the word illiberalism, and I've looked at that speech many times. It is a very specific, very local context. The word flew out, haben suaflata libelli, but so do words. And it was picked up with shock, horror, dismay by the rest of the world, and it has now been given a content that it doesn't have in the original. And in a way, I think that Orban, I don't know, I think it was really a kind of gift to the left, because they now had a polarity, a negative polarity, against which to define themselves. They've therefore attributed to illiberalism all sorts of qualities that is certainly not there in the original, and thereby legitimate their own ideas and their own existence, saying, we are A, B, C, D, and E because we are not illiberal. And the proposition that actually, you could have democracy which is not necessarily liberal simply goes out the ball, because illiberal is now full of its attributions coming from outside. People are very happy if they can live with a positive-negative polarity. They themselves at the positive end. It gives them a sense of moral purposiveness. So that's where we're at. But that has one other consequence. It becomes visible. If you are at the other end of a polarity, then you are visible in terms of its opposite. Or it's a binary opposition. And then you can start to argue with it. We're not quite at that stage yet, I think, certainly not in my experience. In my experience, whenever I say things to colleagues or others, no response. Oh, no, I'm not going to engage with that. It's deeply tiresome, but it tells you that I think at the end of the day, this liberal hegemony is in trouble if it can't even argue its own case. So thank you for your attention.
Ladies and gentlemen, I can't open it to questions. That was we've had two fascinating, well, I won't say performances, that's not the right word, two fascinating lectures doesn't seem quite right either, actually. It seemed they weren't so much lectures, they were a conversation. We've had a fascinating conversation here between two highly qualified conservative minds, and I think it's wrapped up a great many other things that have happened today. I think it's been a lively conference. I think we've covered the topic as well as you can, and it's a very broad topic. We were given a terrific start by John Fonte, and I hope we'll come back to some of the themes in that in future conferences. But throughout the day, we have had a series of talks and criticisms which were always fresh, always lively, and often surprising, but always persuasive. So, and they were persuasive sometimes on opposite sides of the same argument. I mean, we had a real ding-dong between David Satter and between Norman Stone on attitudes towards Russia. I think we come away with an enormous amount to think about and a lot of material for the next conference, which I hope you will attend. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, George.